Were you the man in that car?
A 7-year-old girl confronts a billionaire with a question that could destroy everything he's built, holding evidence that connects his fortune to her wheelchair and his guilt to her survival. In a rain-soaked city where charity masks secrets and donations hide debts, one envelope left at a shelter door sets in motion. A reckoning that neither wealth nor time can escape. When the past refuses to stay buried and a child's body remembers what her mind cannot, the line between savior and ghost becomes impossibly thin, and the only question that matters is whether staying is redemption or just another kind of haunting. Welcome to Golden Heart Stories. This is the story of a man who tried to buy forgiveness, and a child who taught him what it truly means to stay. The storm arrived before dawn, turning the streets of Brooklyn into rivers of reflected neon and shadow. Rain hammered against the corrugated roof of St. Mary's shelter with a violence that suggested the sky itself was breaking apart. Through this deluge, a figure emerged from a black sedan, collar raised against the wind, moving with the deliberate caution of a man who knew he was crossing an invisible threshold he could never uncross. Ibrahim Connor's hands trembled as he withdrew the envelope from his coat, not from the cold, but from the weight of what it represented. The paper had grown damp despite his protection of it, and he could feel the thickness of the check inside, the folded note that had taken him 17 drafts to write. His thumb traced the words he had finally settled on, words that would either redeem him or condemn him further. For the child returned 3 times. He placed it carefully against the shelter's door, wedging it where the morning staff would find it, then retreated into the storm as though fleeing the scene of a crime he had not yet committed. Inside, beyond walls that barely muffled the thunder, 7-year-old Elisa Ward jolted awake in her narrow cot. The nightmare had found her again. The same one that visited whenever storms came, a dream of headlights spinning through darkness and the sensation of being lifted, then left behind. Her small fists clutched the thin blanket as her breathing came in shallow gasps, and in the pre-dawn gloom of the dormitory, she looked impossibly fragile, a child who had learned too early that the world was a place where people left and rarely returned. Her eyes, still glazed with sleep and terror, stared at the rain-streaked window as though searching for a shape in the storm, some confirmation of the abandonment her dreams kept replaying. When director Madeleine Frey arrived at 6:15 in the morning, her shoes squelching on the flooded steps, she nearly missed the envelope altogether. It was tucked so precisely into the doorframe that it seemed intentional, deliberate, as though whoever left it understood the architecture of discretion. She pulled it free and felt immediately the substance of what lay inside, the quality of paper that spoke of wealth and consequence. Inside the shelter's cramped office, under the flickering fluorescent light that made everyone look half dead, she opened it with fingers that had opened 1,000 such envelopes but never one like this. The check made her breath catch. The amount was staggering, enough to renovate the entire facility twice over. But it was the handwritten note beneath it that made her hands go still. Words written in a script that wavered between control and desperation. For the child returned 3 times. She read it again, then a 3rd time. As though repetition might unlock its meaning, her mind immediately went to the children in her care, sorting through stories and histories until it landed on the girl in bed 12. The one with the wheelchair and the nightmares. The one whose file was marked with red tabs indicating multiple failed placements. The audience, watching this moment unfold through Madeleine's widening eyes, and the envelope's mysterious weight, is left suspended in a single burning question that will not let them rest. How does he know her? What invisible thread connects a billionaire's pre-dawn pilgrimage to a child who wakes screaming from dreams of being left behind? The answer lies buried in the storm, in the trembling of hands that placed an envelope. Like a prayer, in the precise words that suggest not charity but something far more personal, far more haunted. The morning light, when it finally breaks through the rain, will bring no clarity. Only deeper shadows and the terrible suspicion that some debts cannot be paid with money. Only with the slow, painful work of staying. The official visit came 3 days after the envelope, announced with the formality that wealth demands and humility cannot escape. Ibrahim Connor arrived at St. Mary's shelter under a sky scrubbed clean by recent rain. His presence preceded by phone calls from his assistant and the nervous energy of staff who had been warned to prepare for importance. He wore a gray suit that cost more than 6 months of the shelter's operating budget, yet he moved through the entrance with the hesitance of a man approaching a confessional. His expensive shoes pausing at the threshold as though some invisible barrier required permission to cross. Madeline Frey greeted him in the common room, a space that smelled of industrial disinfectant and the particular sadness of donated furniture that no one had ever loved. She offered her hand with professional warmth, thanking him for his generosity with words that had been rehearsed but still carried genuine gratitude. He accepted her appreciation with a nod that seemed almost pained, his eyes moving past her shoulders to scan the room with an intensity that suggested he was searching for something specific, something he both dreaded and needed to find. When his gaze finally settled, it locked onto a small figure in a wheelchair near the window. And the color drained from his face so completely that Madeline instinctively reached out to steady him. Elisa Ward sat bathed in afternoon light that turned her dark hair almost translucent at the edges. Her small hands folded in her lap with an unnatural stillness that children her age should never master. She had been watching him since the moment he entered, her 7-year-old eyes possessing a quality of recognition that transcended ordinary memory, as though her body remembered what her conscious mind could not fully grasp. As Ibrahim and Madeline approached, her gaze never wavered, and when they stood before her, she tilted her head with the slow deliberation of someone solving a puzzle that had haunted them for years. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut, vibrating with unspoken history. Ibrahim's throat worked as though forming words. His voice refused to release, and his hands, those trembling instruments of guilt and longing, clenched and unclenched at his sides. Elisa watched this display with an expression far too knowing for her age, and then she spoke with the quiet certainty of absolute truth. "You've been here before, haven't you?" The question landed like an accusation and a plea simultaneously, and Ibrahim's composure, already fragile, seemed to crack at its foundation. He opened his mouth, closed it, then forced out a denial that convinced no one, least of all himself. "No, I haven't." But even as the words left his lips, his hands betrayed him completely, shaking so violently that he had to clasp them together to maintain any semblance of control. The tremor moved up his arms, into his shoulders, until his entire frame seemed gripped by a palsy of recognition and remorse. Elisa continued to stare at him with those ancient eyes, and something passed between them in that moment. A current of shared trauma that needed no language, no explanation, only the brutal honesty of two souls who had orbited the same catastrophe and could no longer pretend they were strangers. Madeline witnessed this exchange with growing unease, her trained instincts recognizing the shape of something far larger than a philanthropist's casual charity. The air in the room had changed, charged with the electrical anticipation of revelation. And she found herself holding her breath as though any movement might shatter whatever fragile understanding was crystallizing between the man and the child. The other children in the room had gone quiet, sensing the gravity of adult secrets pressing down like atmospheric pressure before a storm. The silent recognition that stretched between Ibrahim Connor and Elisa Ward posed a question that hung in the air like smoke, visible but impossible to grasp. What past connects them? What thread of history has pulled a billionaire to his knees before a child in a wheelchair, and why does her simple question strip away his carefully constructed defenses like paper in rain? The answer, lurking just beneath the surface of their locked gazes, promises to rewrite everything that came before and everything that will follow, if only one of them finds the courage to speak it aloud. Madeline's office was a cramped rectangle of institutional beige walls, lined with filing cabinets that groaned under the weight of broken childhoods and bureaucratic failures. She pulled Elisa Ward's file from the second drawer with practiced efficiency. The folder thick with medical reports and social worker assessments that chronicled a life of 7 years compressed into documentary evidence of survival. Ibrahim sat across from her in a chair meant for people smaller and less burdened. His expensive frame folded into cheap plastic while his eyes fixed on the manila folder with the hunger of someone who had been starving for information he already possessed. When Madeline opened the file and began reciting the facts in her professional voice worn smooth by years of delivering tragedy, Ibrahim's face underwent a transformation that started with his jaw tightening and spread upward like a slow-motion collapse. The words came at him like blows he had been bracing for but could never truly prepare to receive. Survivor of a Bronx car accident. Parents deceased on scene. Multiple injuries requiring extensive rehabilitation. The clinical language attempted to sanitize what had been violent and irreversible. But beneath the bureaucratic phrasing lay the raw architecture of catastrophe, and Ibrahim absorbed each detail as though it were being carved into his flesh. His hand moved before his mind could stop it, reaching across the desk to where a yellowed newspaper clipping lay paper clipped to the inside cover of the file. Madeline watched, her narration trailing off, as his fingers closed around the fragile newsprint. With a gentleness that contradicted the violence of what came next. He lifted it free, his eyes scanning words he must have read 1,000 times before, and then with a deliberation that seemed almost ceremonial. He tore the clipping free from its metal clasp. The sound of paper ripping filled the small office with a finality that made Madeline's breath catch. And she saw in his face a grief so profound it had fossilized into something harder and more dangerous than mere sadness. The headline was still visible in his shaking hands before he folded it and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Where it settled against his heart like evidence or condemnation. Bronx crash, one child survives. Those 5 words contained entire universes of loss and guilt, and the way Ibrahim's fingers lingered over his breast pocket suggested he was either protecting a sacred relic or imprisoning a confession he could not yet release into the world. Madeline started to speak, to question this strange possession of official documents, but movement in the doorway silenced her. Elisa had wheeled herself to the threshold of the office, her small form backlit by the fluorescent glare of the hallway, and in her lap lay a piece of paper and a scattered collection of crayons. She did not ask permission to enter but simply rolled forward with the determined focus of a child. On a mission that adults would neither understand nor be allowed to interrupt. She positioned herself near the window where light fell across her work, and with careful deliberation that suggested ritual rather than art, she began to draw. Her small hand moved across the paper in strokes that were too confident, too specific, as though she were not creating an image, but transcribing a memory that visited her in nightmares. The shape emerged gradually under her crayon, a car rendered in the simple geometry of childhood but unmistakable in its subject. Above it, she drew a jagged line of yellow that split the sky, lightning frozen in the moment before impact. Ibrahim rose from his chair as though pulled by invisible wires. His body drawn toward the window and the child and the drawing that laid bare what words had failed to capture. He stood behind her, looking down at the crude rendering of the accident that had destroyed multiple lives and left only fragments and survivors. And his face became a mask of recognition so complete that denial was no longer possible. Madeline watched them both, the billionaire and the orphan, the man with trembling hands and the child who drew cars under lightning, and understanding began to crystallize in her mind like ice forming on glass. Viewers watching this silent tableau, this convergence of file and clipping and drawing, begin to feel the dark link taking shape between them. A connection forged in violence and preserved in guilt. A past that refuses to remain buried no matter how much money is offered at church doors or how many years pass in attempted forgetting. Rose Bennett had spent 42 years as a pediatric nurse before retirement claimed her body. But not her instinct for healing, and she volunteered at St. Mary's 3 afternoons each week because purpose does not respect the arbitrary boundaries of employment. She arrived on Thursday to find Ibrahim Connor standing beside Elisa's wheelchair with the awkward paralysis of someone who wanted desperately to help, but had no idea where to begin, his hands hovering uselessly in the air like birds that had forgotten how to land. The child needed repositioning, her weight shifted to prevent pressure sores. A task that required both strength and the kind of gentle precision that comes only from repetition and care. Rose approached with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who had seen enough fumbling good intentions to last several lifetimes. And she took Ibrahim's hands in her own weathered ones without asking permission. Her fingers were mapped with veins and age spots, testament to decades of holding what was fragile. And she guided his palms to the proper positions on the wheelchair's frame with a firmness that brooked no resistance. She showed him how to brace his legs, how to distribute weight through his core. Rather than straining his back, how to communicate with touch so the child would know what was coming and could prepare her small body for the transition. Ibrahim followed her instructions with a concentration that seemed excessive for such simple mechanics. His brow furrowed as though he were memorizing sacred text rather than learning basic care techniques. But as Rose stepped back to let him attempt the maneuver alone, something extraordinary happened that made her instruction die on her lips. His hands moved with a fluidity that contradicted everything about his supposed inexperience. Finding purchase points and angles of support with the unconscious grace of muscle memory that ran deeper than conscious thought. The positioning was perfect, the transition smooth, each micro-adjustment executed with a precision that should have required months of practice. But instead emerged fully formed, as though his body had been waiting years to remember what his mind had tried desperately to forget. Rose's eyes narrowed with the suspicion of someone whose profession had taught her to read the language of bodies better than words. But she said nothing, merely watched as Ibrahim completed the task with hands that trembled not from uncertainty but from the weight of recognition. When Elisa settled into her adjusted position, she turned her head to look up at him, and her 7-year-old face held an expression that was both question and accusation. Wonder and grief compressed into a single moment of terrible clarity. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. But it carried the force of revelation that shatters carefully maintained lies and exposes foundations built on sand. "Your hands feel like my dad's." The words hit Ibrahim with physical force, and he stumbled backward. As though pushed, his face draining of color until he looked like a man who had just witnessed his own execution. His hands, those treacherous instruments of buried truth, began to shake so violently that he had to press them against his thighs to keep them from betraying him further. But the damage was done, the recognition spoken aloud and given weight in the air between them. And there was no way to unsay it, no way to pretend that her body had not remembered what trauma and time had tried to erase. Rose watched this collapse with the clinical detachment of someone trained to observe symptoms rather than judge their meaning. But even she could not miss the guilt that flickered across Ibrahim's features like lightning illuminating a landscape of devastation. His eyes, which had been so carefully controlled during the physical instruction, now swam with something that looked dangerously close to grief or confession or both. Tangled together in a knot too complex to separate. He opened his mouth as though to explain, to deny, to confess, but no sound emerged except a sharp intake of breath that sounded like drowning. Elisa continued to stare at him with those knowing eyes that had seen too much and understood more than any child should, and in the charged silence that followed her declaration. The truth hung between them like a body suspended in water, visible but untouchable, present but impossible to grasp. His hands remembered what his lips refused to speak, and her body recognized what her mind could not fully retrieve. And between them stretched the terrible gap of all that remained unspoken but could no longer be denied. The media descended on the story with the ravenous efficiency of vultures. Who had caught the scent of moral ambiguity and human interest colliding in profitable ways? By Monday morning, Ibrahim Connor's name blazed across headlines that transformed philanthropy into psychological pathology. Each article competing to frame his generosity as the most sinister variety of self-serving theater. They called him a manipulative savior chasing redemption through a child's suffering, a billionaire attempting to purchase absolution for unnamed sins. A man whose charity was nothing more than elaborate performance art designed to soothe a guilty conscience that no amount of money could truly cleanse. The television segments were worse, talking heads dissecting his motives with the confident brutality of people who had never met him, but felt qualified to excavate his soul on national television. Psychologists speculated about savior complexes and wealthy narcissists who collected broken things to make themselves feel whole. Social workers questioned whether a man with his resources and evident emotional complications should be allowed anywhere near vulnerable children. The internet, that great democratizer of judgment, produced think pieces and Twitter threads. That turned his story into a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of wealth and the dangers of mistaking transaction for transformation. Ibrahim ignored it all with a discipline that suggested either profound inner strength or complete emotional shutdown. Refusing interviews and statements with a silence that only fed the speculation further. Instead, he channeled everything into concrete action that required no explanation and permitted no misinterpretation. He purchased a brownstone on a tree-lined street in Brooklyn where autumn leaves were just beginning to turn the sidewalks into mosaics of red and gold. And he began renovations with the focused intensity of someone building not just a house, but an argument against every accusation that had been leveled at his character. The contractors he hired watched in bewilderment as he demanded modifications that made no sense for a single man living alone. Ramps appeared where stairs had been, their slopes calculated with mathematical precision to accommodate wheelchair navigation. Doorways were widened until the entire ground floor became a continuous flow of accessible space, no threshold too narrow, no corner too tight for easy passage. An elevator was installed where a coat closet had been, the machinery humming with expensive German engineering designed to operate with whisper-quiet reliability. Every surface was lowered, every switch repositioned, every detail reconsidered through the lens of someone whose mobility existed at a different height and required different accommodations. When the foreman asked who all this was for, pointing at blueprints that clearly indicated a child's needs rather than adult preferences, Ibrahim paused in his inspection of the newly installed grab bars in the bathroom. His hand rested on the cool metal, testing its stability with a pressure that suggested he was imagining weight and trust. And the thousand small ways a body learns to depend on its environment. His answer came slowly, each word carefully chosen as though he were making a vow rather than explaining a construction decision. For someone I might finally deserve. The statement hung in the air of the half-finished house, surrounded by sawdust and the smell of fresh paint, and the foreman had the good sense not to ask for clarification. There was something in Ibrahim's voice, a quality of resolve mixed with self-awareness, that suggested he understood exactly how the world saw him, and had decided that the only response worth making was the kind that required years rather than sound bites, presence rather than publicity. The slow accumulation of daily actions that might eventually add up to something resembling redemption. The tone of his entire endeavor shifted in that moment, the house becoming less a construction project and more a declaration of intent. What had begun in guilt was transforming into something more durable and dangerous. A commitment that acknowledged past failures while refusing to let them dictate future possibilities. The media could call him whatever they wanted, dissect his motives with whatever psychological frameworks they preferred. But none of their words could change the fact of ramps being built and doorways being widened. And a house being transformed into a promise that Ibrahim Connor intended to keep, whether the world believed him capable of it or not. The whispers started in the shelter's kitchen where staff gathered during shift changes, spreading through the building like smoke seeping under doorways until even the children heard fragments of speculation that adults thought they were keeping hidden. The rumors carried weight because they contained just enough truth to be plausible and just enough mystery to be compelling. Passed from mouth to ear in voices lowered to the pitch of scandal and sympathy intermingled. He once lost a child, they said, the words taking on different inflections depending on who spoke them. Some with pity that bordered on reverence, others with darker implications about grief that had curdled into obsession and twisted into something potentially dangerous for everyone involved. Elisa heard the whispers during breakfast when two volunteers spoke too loudly near the serving line, and again during her physical therapy session. When the therapist stepped into the hallway for a phone call she mistakenly believed was private. The fragments accumulated in the child's mind like pieces of a puzzle she had been trying to solve since the moment Ibrahim Connor first walked through the shelter's doors with his trembling hands and his eyes that recognized her before she could fully remember him. She was 7 years old but had learned in her short violent life that adults often revealed more through what they avoided saying than what they spoke aloud. And she had been collecting silences and evasions like evidence in a case she was building against reality itself. The article she found was not discovered by accident, but through the deliberate determination of someone who had learned that truth was something you had to hunt rather than wait to receive. She wheeled herself to the shelter's small office when Madeline was at lunch, navigating with the quiet efficiency of children who have mastered the art of being unseen. And she searched through the file cabinet with hands that barely reached the middle drawer. Her own folder lay thick with medical reports and court documents that reduced her life to procedural checkpoints. But it was the newspaper clipping that had been returned to its place after Ibrahim tore it free that caught her attention, its torn edge. A testament to violence that matched the violence in her own fractured memories. She read the article with the slow deliberation of someone decoding their own origin story, each word landing with the weight of confirmation for suspicions she had carried in her bones before her mind could articulate them. The date of the crash, the location in the Bronx. The description of weather conditions that matched the lightning she drew compulsively in every picture she made. And then the detail that made her small hands clench the paper until it crumpled, the mention of a witness who tried to help but could not save everyone, a man whose name was redacted in the archived version but whose presence in her life now seemed less like coincidence and more like haunting. When Ibrahim arrived for his usual afternoon visit, she was waiting for him in the common room with the article spread across her lap like evidence at a trial. She had positioned herself where the light fell across her face, perhaps instinctively understanding that confrontation required visibility, that accusations delivered from shadow carried less weight than those spoken in full illumination. He saw her before he saw the paper, and his step faltered in a way that suggested his body had learned to anticipate her capacity for seeing through the careful constructions he had built around himself. She held up the article with hands that did not shake, her 7-year-old voice carrying across the room with a clarity that silenced the other children and froze the staff in mid-action. "Were you the man in that car?" The question was both simpler and more devastating than anything the media had asked, stripping away all complexity and leaving only the essential binary of presence and responsibility. Ibrahim's face underwent transformations too rapid to catalogue, each emotion flashing across his features like frames in a film running at the wrong speed. Denial formed on his lips but never achieved sound, the words dying before birth because even he could not sustain the lie in the face of her direct accusation. His mouth opened, closed, opened again like a man drowning on dry land, and the silence that followed her question expanded until it filled the entire room with pressure that made breathing difficult for everyone present. He could not answer because any answer would be either a confession or a lie. And he had apparently reached the limit of what he could deny to this child who carried in her body the evidence of what he had witnessed and failed to prevent. The tension reached its peak in that suspended moment. The man and the child locked in a confrontation that transcended age and power and all the usual hierarchies. The question hung between them unanswered but undeniable, and everyone watching understood that they were witnessing not just personal drama, but a reckoning, the moment when carefully maintained pretense collides with unbearable truth and discovers it cannot survive the impact. The storm arrived without warning, turning the evening sky over Brooklyn into something violent and biblical. Ibrahim stood at the center of the Brooklyn Bridge, rain hammering against his shoulders with enough force to soak through his coat in minutes. His phone pressed to his ear as water streamed down his face and made it impossible to tell whether he was crying or simply drowning in the downpour. Below him, the East River churned black and furious, and the bridge cables sang with wind that sounded like voices calling from somewhere he could never reach. His hands shook as he dialed Madeline's number, not from cold but from the weight of what he was about to release into the world, words that had been locked behind his teeth for so long. They had calcified into something sharp enough to cut on the way out. When she answered with concern already evident in her voice, having seen his name on the screen and knowing that nothing good came from calls made during storms from bridges at night, he spoke with a finality that suggested he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind but was still unprepared for the reality of actually saying the words aloud. No more hiding. The declaration fell between them across the phone line, and then the story began pouring out of him with the same relentless force as the rain, each word scraping against his throat like gravel. The flashback unfolded in fragments as he spoke, his voice breaking and reforming around the memories he had spent years trying to bury. He had a sister once, younger by 3 years, a woman whose laugh could fill entire rooms and whose kindness extended to everyone she encountered. She had been driving that night through the Bronx with her family, husband and daughter buckled into a car that would become their tomb, and Ibrahim had been following in his own vehicle. Because they were supposed to meet for dinner at a restaurant neither of them would ever reach. He saw the accident unfold in his rearview mirror, headlights spinning through darkness as the car hydroplaned on rain-slicked asphalt and collided with physics and metal and the absolute indifference of the universe to human plans. He was the first one there, running back through the storm with his heart already knowing what his mind refused to accept. His sister was already gone, her husband crushed behind the wheel and in the back seat. A child was screaming with a sound that would haunt every quiet moment for the rest of his life. He pulled Elisa from the wreckage, his hands learning the weight of her small body as he lifted her free from twisted metal. And then the ambulance arrived and took her away, and he stood in the rain covered in blood. That was not his own, understanding with terrible clarity that he had been too late to save the people he loved. But just in time to save the one who would spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair because of seconds in rain and the cruel mathematics of velocity and impact. I couldn't save her, but I can stay for this one. The words came out raw and scraped clean of pretense, and through the phone Madeline could hear the rain and the traffic, and beneath it all, the sound of a man finally admitting to the guilt that had been eating him alive from the inside. He explained how he had watched Elisa from a distance for years. Anonymous donations and surveillance disguised as concern, unable to approach because what could he possibly say to the child who was alive because his sister was dead? He had been the witness who couldn't save everyone, the man whose hands remembered her weight, the ghost who had been haunting the periphery of her life because staying away felt like abandoning her twice, and getting close felt like claiming something he had no right to possess. The confession lasted 20 minutes, his voice growing hoarse, as he stood on the bridge and let the storm witness what he had hidden from everyone, including himself. When he finally fell silent, the rain continued its percussion against steel and stone, and Madeline's breath came through the phone. In quiet recognition of everything that had just shifted into terrible clarity. The man was not her savior or her ghost, but something more complicated and more human. Someone who had been trying to outrun his own failure by staying close to its evidence, building ramps and widening doorways as penance for the life his sister lost and the mobility Elisa would never regain. The truth, finally spoken aloud above the dark water, offered no absolution. But at least provided the brutal honesty that staying required, the acknowledgement that redemption was not something purchased with donations but earned through the accumulated weight of every tomorrow he showed up. The courtroom smelled of old wood and bureaucratic exhaustion, afternoon light filtering through tall windows in dusty shafts. Ibrahim sat at a table that felt too small for the weight of what was being decided. His hands folded in front of him with a stillness that required conscious effort to maintain. Across the aisle, the foster couple who had returned Elisa 3 times sat with their lawyer, a man whose expensive suit and predatory smile suggested he had built a career on turning compassion into suspicion. The attack began methodically, each question designed to strip away Ibrahim's testimony until only his guilt remained exposed. They questioned his sudden interest in a child. He claimed not to know, the timing of his donations, the renovation of a house clearly designed for someone specific. The lawyer's voice carried the smooth confidence of someone who knew that wealth and tragedy made excellent ingredients for reasonable doubt. And he wielded Ibrahim's own actions like weapons against him, each generous gesture reframed as evidence of obsession rather than atonement. Ibrahim absorbed the accusations with the exhausted dignity of someone who had already condemned himself more thoroughly than any lawyer ever could. When finally given the opportunity to speak, he rose slowly, his expensive suit unable to hide the way his shoulders had begun to curve under years of weight. His voice emerged raw and undefended. Charity ends with applause. Staying begins with tomorrow's alarm. The statement landed in the courtroom like something too simple to be dismissed and too true to be argued against. Ibrahim continued with the halting honesty of someone who had stopped trying to convince anyone except through basic facts of commitment. He spoke about the difference between writing checks and showing up when Elisa woke screaming from nightmares, between funding programs and learning how to help a child transfer from wheelchair to bed without making her feel like a burden. Madeline was called next, and she approached with a manila folder thick enough to tell its own story. She began presenting 6 months of documentation the court had not requested but could not ignore. Security footage showing Ibrahim arriving before dawn and leaving after dark, not for photo opportunities but for ordinary maintenance of connection. Physical therapy logs signed by him when staff shortages meant Elisa would otherwise go alone. Text messages at 3 in the morning asking what to do when a child wouldn't eat, correspondence with doctors about medication adjustments. Receipts for books and art supplies that never appeared in donation ledgers because they were personal rather than institutional. The footage played on a screen, silent testimony to hours that transformed intention into relationship. Ibrahim helping Elisa with homework, his patience visible even without sound as he explained the same concept multiple times without frustration. Ibrahim sitting beside her wheelchair during meals, not hovering but simply present, the kind of consistent proximity that children need to believe they matter. Ibrahim teaching her chess, the board positioned at the right height. His hands moving pieces with careful attention, understanding that trust was built through repetition of small reliable gestures rather than grand declarations. The courtroom fell into a silence that felt different from the aggressive quiet that had preceded it. This one carrying the weight of people confronting evidence that complicated their assumptions. The judge watched the final clip, Ibrahim adjusting Elisa's jacket before they went outside, the gesture so automatic and parental that it transcended any narrative about ulterior motives. When the screen went dark, no one spoke immediately, as though words would diminish what had just been witnessed. The truth, presented without embellishment or legal maneuvering, needed no defense because it existed independent of interpretation. The evidence was not Ibrahim's wealth or his guilt or even his relationship to the accident that had created the child's need and his obligation. The evidence was the alarm that went off every morning. And the fact that he answered it, the daily choice to show up that transformed charity into something that looked remarkably like love. Even if he would never claim that word for himself because claiming seemed like one more way of taking what belonged to someone else. The verdict was delayed for reasons the court declined to specify, leaving Ibrahim suspended in a limbo that felt like punishment disguised as procedure. He left the courthouse under a sky that threatened rain, the air thick with humidity that made New York feel like it was holding its breath. Rather than return to his brownstone or the shelter, he drove to the small community garden 3 blocks from his house. A pocket of green that the neighborhood had carved from concrete through years of stubborn hope. The garden was nearly empty at this hour, afternoon light slanting low across raised beds where tomatoes hung heavy and basil sent up its sharp scent. Ibrahim knelt in the dirt beside an empty plot assigned to him months ago, his expensive pants absorbing moisture from soil still damp from yesterday's storm. He had brought a single plant, a perennial that would survive winter and return each spring if properly tended. And he positioned it carefully in the hole he dug with hands that had learned gentleness through necessity. The marker he placed beside it was simple wood with clean letters burned into the surface. Anna, his sister's name, finally given a place in the world again after years of being spoken only in private grief. He pressed the marker into the earth with both hands until it felt secure enough to withstand weather and time. And then he sat back on his heels and let the rain that had been threatening finally begin. It started as mist, then evolved into proper drops that darkened his shirt and turned the dirt around the plant into mud that would help establish roots. He stayed kneeling as the rain increased, his head bowed in something that resembled acknowledgement, the simple recognition that some debts could never be fully paid. But that the attempt to honor them was all that remained. The garden around him took on the hushed quality that rain brings to growing things. And Ibrahim understood that this was what staying looked like, this commitment to tending something that would outlast the immediate moment. He did not hear Elisa's approach until her wheelchair was beside him, Rose Bennett. Pushing her along the garden's gravel path with the quiet competence of someone who understood when silence was more appropriate than greeting. The child looked down at him kneeling in the rain, at the freshly planted flower and the marker bearing a name she had never heard. But which carried weight she could sense even without explanation. She studied the scene with the solemn attention that children bring to moments they recognize as important even when they cannot fully articulate why. And then she reached into her lap and withdrew a folded piece of paper that had been protected from the rain by being tucked inside her jacket. The note was written in the careful block letters of someone for whom writing was still labor. Each word chosen with the economy that comes from having to think hard about what matters most. Ibrahim took it from her hand with fingers that left mud smears on the white paper. And he read the simple sentence that she had composed without any adult guidance or intervention. If someone stays, I can wait. The words were both permission and challenge, the acknowledgement that she understood what was at stake. And had made her own calculation about whether trust was worth the risk of disappointment. Ibrahim looked up at her through rain that made it impossible to tell if he was crying, and his voice when he spoke carried the weight of a vow that he was making not just to her but to himself and to the sister whose name was planted in the ground beside him. "I'll come back tomorrow." It was the simplest promise he had ever made, containing none of the grand gestures that wealth usually enabled, just the basic commitment to show up again when the sun rose. Rose stood holding the wheelchair handles, witness to this exchange that felt more binding than any legal proceeding. And the rain continued its steady work of establishing roots. When dawn came with its phone call, the verdict delivered through official channels with all the formality that bureaucracy demanded, adoption approved. It would find Ibrahim already awake, already preparing for the tomorrow he had promised, already understanding that redemption was not a destination but a direction, not something you earned once, but something you chose again and again every time the alarm offered you another chance to stay. The brownstone stood on a street where spring had arrived early, transforming bare branches into clouds of pale green. Elisa's wheelchair navigated the ramp that Ibrahim had insisted be beautiful as well as functional, its smooth surface allowing her to approach the front door with dignity. The house had been waiting for this moment with patient stillness, every doorway widened, every surface lowered, every corner softened in anticipation of someone small, who moved through the world differently than architects had originally imagined. Inside, sunlight poured through windows positioned to capture morning light without harsh glare. The walls were painted a blue that Elisa had chosen, not cartoon brightness but something deeper, the color of sky after rain when the world feels washed clean. The open floor plan meant she could move from living room to kitchen to library nook without encountering obstacles, and the elevator connecting floors hummed with such quiet efficiency that its presence felt like thoughtfulness made mechanical. Ibrahim watched her explore with the careful distance of someone who understood that ownership required both presence and space. She wheeled herself from room to room with methodical attention, her small hands touching surfaces and testing the height of counters and light switches, her face showing neither excessive gratitude nor suspicion, but something more complicated, the cautious hope of someone who had learned that homes could be temporary but who was willing to risk believing again if the evidence supported it. When she reached what was clearly meant to be her bedroom, she stopped at the threshold, taking in the space that had been prepared with meticulous attention. The bed was positioned near the window where she could see the garden Ibrahim tended, the desk sat at exactly the right height for her wheelchair, and the walls held empty shelves waiting to be filled with whatever she decided mattered. It was a room that acknowledged her past while refusing to let that past dictate her future, a space that said, "You belong here not because of what happened to you but because of who you are becoming." She turned to look at Ibrahim, who stood in the hallway with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders, carrying the tension of someone waiting for a verdict that would determine everything. Her voice when she spoke was quiet but absolutely clear, the words emerging with the weight of someone who had thought carefully about what needed to be said, and had decided that directness was the only language adequate to the moment. "Don't pick someone else again." The statement was not accusation exactly but something more fundamental, the laying down of terms that would govern their relationship going forward. It acknowledged the three families who had returned her to the shelter. The pattern of being chosen and then unchosen, the specific trauma of abandonment that had shaped her understanding of what adults promised versus what they actually delivered. Ibrahim absorbed this with the full force of recognition, his throat working as he swallowed against emotion that threatened to make speech impossible. And when he finally answered, his voice carried the firmness of someone making a commitment he had no intention of breaking. "Never. I already chose us." The use of us rather than you was deliberate, the acknowledgement that this was not rescue or charity but the formation of something mutual. A family that would be built not on the traditional foundations of biology or marriage but on the harder and more durable ground of daily choice and sustained presence. Elisa studied his face for a long moment, reading whatever she needed to read there. And then she nodded once and wheeled herself into the room that was now hers, beginning the work of arranging her few possessions in ways that would transform generic space into personal territory. The scene faded slowly, the camera pulling back to show the house in its neighborhood context, the ramp, leading to the door that stayed open, the windows that let light flood inward, the garden where a marker-bearing Anna stood among flowers that would bloom and fade and bloom again. And beneath it all, almost too faint to hear but undeniably present, the sound of an alarm clock. Preparing to sound, that daily mechanical voice that would continue to call Ibrahim into another morning, another chance to stay, another opportunity to prove that redemption was not dramatic transformation, but the quiet accumulation of ordinary days strung together by the simple determination to show up when the darkness split and the light returned. Some stories don't really end, they stay with us, like quiet echoes of kindness and courage. If this one stayed with you, share it with someone who still believes in second chances. We'd love to hear your thoughts below and welcome you to our growing community of hearts. Thank you for watching. This has been Golden Heart Stories.